Do you think we have a terrible economy? Because I do. And if you do as well, I have a doozy for you.
Now, on the state of the economy, I would say that the broad contours of the economy are improving. The potential of the economy, the real results of the economy are improving, but I think it can improve more. And I think in the years ahead, I think the economy's potential is strengthening.
This is a proper journey to understand the U.S. economy through the auspices of the Federal Reserve and how it works in tandem with the Treasury. And I'm going to explain why we're having all the wrong conversations, because we're putting a square peg into a round sinkhole. Also, this is going to be long, maybe even coma-inducing, but hopefully it's a revelation that gets to the heart of how sick our nation is, and that once you see it, you can't unsee it. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR, and don't say I didn't warn you. Basically, there are two sides of the economic house, monetary and fiscal. And right now, all eyes are on the monetary side as we cross-examine a new potential Federal Reserve chairman. And we're all pretty familiar with the backdrop. Donald Trump wants rates in the basement. We also have massive structural deficits that cost the government $1 trillion a year to service. And the government has sent trillions of dollars into the financial system on both sides of the house, and it needs to be managed. As far as we're concerned, we're just not allowed to have nice things anymore. So we're going to talk about the Warsh era at the Fed and show just how complex, interconnected, and massive the problem is, but also how his worldview just doesn't square with reality. Now, given all of the attention to the monetary side of the house, you might be inclined to think that that's where all the action is. And that's part of the problem. Ultimately, it's our fiscal house that's completely out of order. So to eliminate any doubt, Kevin Warsh is going to be the next chair of the Federal Reserve, assuming the administration drops the absurd criminal referral against Jerome Powell. Warsh is going to take the chair. But much of the focus in this confirmation hearing has centered on two things: the direction of interest rates and Fed independence. Now, given Trump's bellicose stance on rates, the two issues are, at the moment, inextricably linked. And there's also the question about Warsh's wealth and his ties to Jeffrey Epstein, but that's for another day. So Warsh is in this position for a reason. Right now, there's not a lot of daylight in between him and Donald Trump, although I'm confident that there's an enormous intellectual gap. Because Trump knows one thing: lower interest rates means more lending and refinancing. And as a real estate guy, that's pretty much all he cares about. And having served as the youngest Fed governor under Bernanke in the Bush years, Warsh, on the other hand, has a real pedigree, along with an elite education and an estimable career in finance. And because he has such an established presence, we have access to his prior writings and therefore his worldview. As such, we know that Warsh thinks that short-term rates are too high. So, bonus point to Trump. He also thinks that the Fed's balance sheet is too big, probably above Trump's pay grade. But in speeches going back a decade, he's argued that shrinking the balance sheet by about $1 trillion is the equivalent to a 50 basis point rate hike. So his big idea, which is already nicknamed QT for rate cuts, is to shrink the balance sheet while cutting short-term rates. And the theory goes like this: when the Fed shrinks its balance sheet, it lets treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, which is what they hold for collateral, roll off without replacement, which pulls reserves out of the banking system. And that nudges long-term yields higher and tightens the financial conditions that inflate things like stocks and housing. Now, the theory also holds that cutting short-term rates simultaneously eases the cost of credit cards and auto loans and business lending. So in Warsh's framework, you get stimulus where Main Street borrowers are concerned without juicing the asset bubbles where Wall Street speculates. Sounds pretty perfect on paper. Now remember, when the Fed expands its balance sheet, it buys treasuries from other banks, and it credits their reserve accounts with new money, effectively keeping banks flush with cash while maintaining a steady bid for treasuries. That's the mechanism that has propped up the bond market for 15 years, by the way. So let's put ourselves in the banking system shoes when Warsh flips the switch and then runs it in reverse. Let's say you're JP Morgan or Bank of America or any of the institutions that matter. The Fed is now letting treasuries roll off without replacement under his scenario, which means two things are happening at the same time if you're the bank. First, your reserve balance at the Fed, the cash you hold on to meet regulatory requirements and fund redemptions, is shrinking because the Fed is extinguishing reserves as its balance sheet contracts. Second, the Treasury is still issuing, which means somebody has to buy that paper. And the primary dealer rules say that someone is probably you. So you're being asked to absorb more Treasury supply with less cash on hand. How do you respond then? You tighten. You pull back on interbank lending. You raise rates on corporate revolving credit facilities. You get pickier about commercial real estate loans and small business lines. Maybe you even demand wider spreads on mortgages. Essentially, the cost of money in the real economy goes up, not because the Fed raised the policy rate, but because the plumbing in the system is draining. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Banks have a choice when reserves get scarce. They can hoard cash and pull back on lending, or they can lean on the Fed's standing repo facility at the discount window to plug the holes. Now, in a healthy system, they do a little bit of both. In a stress system, say the kind where a basis trade in the Cayman Islands blows up and primary dealers suddenly can't take down an auction, they all reach for the same lifelines at the same time. That is exactly what happened, by the way, in September of 2019 when the repo rate spiked to 10% overnight and the Fed had to intervene in an emergency. It also happened in March of 2020 during COVID when the Treasury market seized. So the balance sheet had been shrinking for 2 years leading into each of those events. So what I'm saying isn't speculation. This is how the banking system behaves. So now let's put the theory into practice with today's situation where Warsh would theoretically be walking into. Let's say he shrinks the balance sheet. Bank reserves decline. Treasury issuance continues at this historic volume because of our debt and our deficits. Banks tighten lending into the real economy, that's us, but they also become the marginal buyers of the new debt, and their appetite is finite because of the cash. So the moment that reserves get tight enough that the repo market, let's say, just hiccups or a primary dealer can't clear an auction, the whole thing snaps back to the Fed, which means Warsh either expands the balance sheet again at that point, or he just watches a funding crisis unfold and then gets yelled at by the president while we all devolve into chaos. So this is the quandary in operational form. Warsh's framework requires the banking system to absorb more treasury supply with less cash and keep the real economy humming. The banking system can only do one of these things. It can't do both. Given our historic debt and Scott Bessent's strategy of rolling over longer duration bonds into shorter term instruments, something that, oh, by the way, he criticized when other Treasury secretaries did it, it leaves a massive hole in the financial system equation. Who exactly is going to buy all of that Treasury debt? Bessent is turning over an astronomical wall of paper, issued, by the way, at cheap rates from the past. Only now it's getting replaced at today's yields because the longer-term yields are too high for comfort. The interest bill on the national debt has already crossed $1 trillion a year, and it's just going to keep getting higher. As it is, the Treasury is facing serious headwinds, like the latest Treasury International Capital Report, something that we've talked about before, tick data, right? It dropped on April 15th and it covers February data. So this is before the world has really begun to crater because of the Iran war. So this is before that time. Now the headlines were basically favorable because it said that foreign holdings had hit a record of 9.4 trillion. So great. All's well in the bond market. Or is it? Because if you dig into the report, you have to look at the split, which is ugly. Foreign official institutions, again, this is central banks and sovereign wealth funds, for example, the stable money in the world, were net sellers to the tune of $46 billion in long-term U.S. securities in February. And what cash they did keep rotated into T-bills, those short-term bonds that we just talked about. In fact, the foreign official share of the Treasury market has fallen from 50% in the early 2010s to 30% today. So every day, the Treasury is selling new debt into the market through auctions, and these auctions are telegraphing strain. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget noted that recent auctions cleared at higher than expected yields with weaker demand, which required greater takedown by primary dealers, the banks that are legally obligated to bid so an auction doesn't fail. So who's filling the gap left by the central banks? Private sources. And also, hedge funds that are dressed up as official sources that are domiciled in the Caymans, and they're playing an arbitrage game in something called the basis trade. Now, you might recall the pieces that we did on how the Fed's own research showed how SEC data revealed that Cayman holdings are about $2 trillion, not $400 billion like the tick reports say. And this is not stable demand. That's a bonfire of leverage that can evaporate overnight. So here's the next quandary in a sentence. The Treasury needs a historic volume of buyers, and official sources, the patient ones, are leaving. Private buyers are price sensitive and flighty, so the marginal buyer holding the whole structure together by default has increasingly been, ta-da, the Federal Reserve and its balance sheet. So the next Fed chair wants to shrink this balance sheet. This is the single most important macroeconomic contradiction in DC right now, and almost nobody is talking about it. Warsh's framework works on a whiteboard, but it falls apart the minute that the Treasury has to auction $100 billion of notes and the primary dealers look at each other and say, you buying? And then everybody just looks at the floor. So before we get to what I believe is the bigger fix, we have to understand what the administration's brain trust thinks is the actual fix. They, believe it or not, have a plan, and it's called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, and I wish I was joking. So you might remember us talking about Stephen Myron, who's currently a Fed governor and formerly the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Well, he wrote a blueprint, a 41-page paper in 2024 that has 5 pieces. And we have to know every single one of them because each one would show up in your life personally, whether you voted for this administration or not. So phase 1, tax or withhold foreign central banks' interest payments. So Myron wants to use the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, that's a sanctions law basically, to impose what he calls a user fee on foreign official holders of Treasury. In English, it means that the U.S. government would just refuse to pay some or all of the interest that it owes to the central banks of China, Japan, Germany, anybody that they deem to be abusing our reserve currency status. Now, the Council on Foreign Relations have noted that this is something called a selective default. But you can't tell Beijing you're keeping the coupon this quarter and expect them not to notice and then just dump all of our treasuries. In other words, it's not going to work. Now, piece 2 is century bonds for allies. Essentially, we would strong-arm friendly countries like Japan, which is basically a client state of ours, or it was until the new administration comes in. It's going to be interesting to see. Or maybe the Gulf states or NATO members that come under the defense umbrella. We talk them into swapping their existing treasuries for a 100-year zero coupon bond. Now, you hold the paper for a century, but you get no interest. You get your money back in 21-26. In exchange, you get continued access to U.S. security guarantees and maybe a tariff carve-out if you're lucky. Once again, the Council on Foreign Relations has thoughts on this one as well, calling it a debt jubilee in slow motion. This is honestly just bad faith and exploitation of our privilege. Now, part 3 is a currency intervention a la the 1985 Plaza Accord. Basically, get the dollar down by roughly 20% against other major trading currencies, either through coordinated G7 intervention or unilateral treasury action via the Exchange Stabilization Fund. And this is supposed to make American exports competitive again and bring manufacturing back home. Where have I heard that one before? Oh, that's right, tariffs. The 4th piece is Treasury-Fed coordination on long rates. And this one is another huge swing. So Myron proposes reviving something like Operation Twist from the 60s. Essentially, the Fed explicitly coordinates with the Treasury to cap long-term yields. And he points to the 1977 Federal Reserve Reform Act, which gave the Fed a third mandate that nobody really talks about, which is to moderate long-term interest rates. Now, this law has been dormant for half a century, but he wants to dust it off to weaponize it. So in practice, this means the Fed stops pretending that it cares about inflation at the long end, and it just starts buying or selling whatever it takes to keep the 10-year Treasury yield where the administration wants it. And lastly, tax inbound foreign capital. So under Section 899 of the tax code, new excise taxes or direct transaction taxes on foreign purchases of U.S. assets would happen. And the logic here is that if the dollar is the reserve currency, foreigners are getting something of value for free, so they should pay for it. So put all these pieces together and you have a system where the Treasury gets its debt issued on favorable terms, the dollar drops, long rates get pinned, foreign holders get fleeced, and the whole thing gets wrapped up and called economic patriotism. So that's the plan that's on the shelf. The problem, and this is where the quandary really bites us, is that every one of those pieces is designed to keep yields low and the debt serviceable, and every one of them requires foreign holders to stick around and eat the terms. And even before this bizarrely punitive and selfish plan is enacted, foreign banks are already voting with their feet. It's hard to imagine them reversing course under worse treatment. Now, there is a tool if the debt gets too big to honor on honest terms, and you might have heard about it lately. It's something called financial repression. The IMF wrote the definitive paper on this in 2011, and they called it an opaque gradual tax. So this one's a big deal. In a nutshell, the government engineers a situation where the interest on your savings is lower than the rate of inflation for years and on purpose, so that the real value of the debt shrinks while the real value of your savings shrinks alongside of it. So think of it this way. Imagine you have 10 grand in savings and it's in an account earning 2%, but inflation's running at 4%. At the end of the year, your statement still says $10,200, so great, you made $200. But that $10,200 buys you what $9,800 bought a year ago. So you actually lost 2% of your purchasing power. The money just kind of evaporates. And the government, which borrowed that dollar from you at 2% while the economy inflates at 4%, paid back its debt in cheaper dollars. So you basically subsidized the Treasury without knowing it. Now, do it for a decade, and that's the post-war playbook. Between 1945 and 1980, basically, the United States liquidated roughly half of its wartime debt through financial repression. And we also had a much higher tax rate at that time and post-war growth from industrialization and all that, but that was the balance sheet trick at least. It was a quiet confiscation of purchasing power from anyone who had a savings account or a pension. Now let's have the proverbial kitchen table discussion. You have a 401k. It owns a target date fund with, let's say, 40 to 60% bonds, mostly treasuries. In a repression regime, your bond allocation earns 2 to 3%, while inflation, again, runs 4 or 5. And every year, in real terms, that slice of your retirement technically shrinks. Not on paper. On paper, the number keeps going up, but in what the money actually buys you when you retire. Or let's say your grandmother has a CD at the credit union and she locked in at 4% for 3 years and is super happy with that rate. But inflation spends that whole 3 years at 4 to 5%. So she doesn't lose $1 of principal, she loses a year's worth of groceries in purchasing power, and the bank sends her a 1099 telling her she owes tax on interest that was already below inflation. So she pays taxes on what is essentially a real loss. Another example, let's say you've been saving for a down payment on a home. Home prices are rising with the money supply and the cost of construction materials, and your down payment fund is sitting in a high-yield savings account at around 3%. But it's falling behind the price of the thing that you're saving for. So you're basically running up a down escalator. So now let's talk about the hallowed and sacrosanct stock market, because you know that this is the one area of the economy that none of these guys wants to damage. It's literally all they seem to care about. Here again, they're in a pickle. And I think it'll help explain why they would twist themselves into knots trying to clamp down on the bond market and pass this camel through the eye of a needle with their grand vision here. If Warsh and Bessent lose control of the long end of the Treasury curve, if the 10-year yield decides that it wants to trade by market forces alone at 5 to 6%, the stock market is in a little bit of trouble. It basically resets because many Americans at the upper end of the spectrum now experience their wealth through an equity portfolio instead of a savings account. So even they're not immune. And this is also true for a lot of retirees. Meanwhile, bonds at 5% start paying you just to sit on the couch, and stocks have to work harder and harder to justify the risk. So corporate America feels it too. Higher borrowing costs mean fewer buybacks, and buybacks have been the marginal buyer of U.S. equities for 15 years. So if Warsh shrinks the Fed's balance sheet, at the same time the Treasury is dumping $10 trillion of issuance on the market and foreign central banks are quietly filing out the back, long yields have to go up. And when long yields go up, equity multiples compress. When equity multiples compress, 401k balances drop. The average American's retirement account is exposed to the 10-year more than anything that the president says on Truth Social. And this is why this balancing act is so utterly difficult. And look, Warsh is going to get the job. And for the foreseeable future, Bessent is going to keep issuing. On the other hand, foreign central banks are going to keep leaving while the hedge fund basis trade in the Caymans is just going to keep substituting leverage for stable demand until maybe one day it doesn't. You can't inflate your way out of debt and maintain the confidence that keeps foreign buyers in the market. Those objectives are in direct conflict with one another. So his whiteboard framework collides with reality. So essentially, he's walking into a Fed that has three bad options. One, let long rates rip and accept the recession and just watch equities crater and hand the administration a political disaster before the elections. Or two, expand the balance sheet again to fill the demand gap, which makes it indistinguishable from what Powell's doing. Or three, coordinate with Bessent's Treasury on a formal repression framework. SLR relief, yield curve control, captive bank holdings, some flavor of the Mar-a-Lago Accord, and basically quietly devalue every saver in the country for a decade. So my bet is on door three, and you'll just hear less from the Fed, and the data that it relies on will sort of change, and they'll just talk a good game over a while we all sit here wondering what the hell happened to our money. And their inflation target will all of a sudden become flexible. I'm hearing a lot of that lately where they're like, maybe 2% just isn't reasonable anymore. And then when the math finally breaks the Fed, it'll temporarily expand its balance sheet. And I'm saying temporarily is doing a lot of work here. So Warsh is walking into an impossible job, and saying that he'll handle it with a smaller footprint is just meaningless. It just can't be done. So with that reality check, let's have a non-technical discussion about what really needs to happen. I'm not saying our debt isn't an issue. I'll just say that for starters. If you run the system the way it's currently designed, you run into problems. And the stock market, meaning the corporations that comprise it, have been running on cheap money, bailouts, government cash, and stock buybacks for almost 20 years. I mean, so much of this was a foregone conclusion, and there's been a lot of ink spilled saying that this is where we were going to wind up. So we're not telling tales out of school. But if we step back and imagine a future state of the country, a different kind of math is possible. The whole notion of not running deficits because they destroy an economy only holds true if you're not in control of the world's currency. As a sovereign currency nation that sits at the center of the global economy, mind you, we still hold the biggest economic cards in the game. The problem with our economic approach is that we just opt to spend money on world-destroying items, as evidenced by the request for a $1.5 trillion military budget. We also refuse to balance the inequality equation at home by allowing the upper end of the income ladder to get away with murder. The reality is, we can run eye-popping deficits until the cows come home, precisely because we are the world's supplier of cash. As of now, And despite Trump's best efforts, the world still needs dollars to run. The problem is that we're forcing everybody into these workarounds in every corner to protect and preserve the capital that's in the least amount of pockets. It works for some people for a very long time until it doesn't, but it never works for the many. So what I'm saying is we need to adjust the framing, and it begins with fiscal discussions at home. A wholesale reprioritization domestically, and a willingness to partner with allies and foes alike on a new and more robust global economic system. See, we can have our cake and eat it too if we're willing to share. A social democracy playbook works extremely well in countries that don't have a fraction of the power and privilege that we do. Imagine how well it would work if we decided to invest in the American people and partner with those abroad. Having competitors is not the same as having enemies, and right now we're making enemies of our competitors and our non-competitive allies alike. So here's what this looks like. Drop the whole tariff regime nonsense and establish a true free trade regime. Invest in emerging markets that have resources that we don't, without demanding that we take over their companies and their governments. Invest in mass affordable housing to increase supply, and you'll reduce pressure on the asset bubble in the housing market and bring prices down, and everybody can have a house. Replace our broken insurance system with Medicare for all. Phase it in over a 5 or 10 year period, and you'll not only have a healthier population, they'll have more disposable income. And here's an unpopular sentiment, but bear with me. Stop focusing on billionaires. Focus on what made them billionaires. Close the corporate tax loophole. Limit the capital preservation trusts that lead to generational hoarding. Limit the volume of stock buybacks, or eliminate it altogether. Eliminate the carried interest tax loophole. Increase corporate tax rates substantially, and fund the IRS through an act of Congress that makes it impossible for future administrations to deplete its resources with an executive action. Shift a substantial portion of the military funding to domestic, client, resilient, and renewable energy infrastructure projects, and use that military ingenuity to do it. Why not make use of our best and brightest in ways that actually protect and preserve the homeland? Develop a New Deal-style civilian labor corps to fill in employment and expertise gaps that the private sector won't touch because there's no profit motive. And aggressively pursue the trillions of dollars hiding offshore, because repatriation of this capital is critical. Yes, I'm talking about potentially expanding the nation's balance sheet, or at a minimum, just moving things around. But I'm also talking about putting that money to good use. Now, keen observers will note the intersection here of modern monetary theory and social democracy. Being good global citizens and economic partners ensures robust demand for our debt. It also reinforces practical things like the petrodollar system, and it restores faith in the United States as a partner and not a terrorist threat. And importantly, this playbook is non-inflationary. Now, the neoliberal set will tell you differently, but it is simply not the case. This is a myth that has been propagated by the Chicago school economists, and now for some reason it's just gospel. But it's not true. Our intense focus on monetary policy has sapped our imaginations of what's possible on the fiscal side of the house. Just because they say that government spending is the third rail doesn't make it true. We need a wholesale rethinking that looks a lot like the old New Deal thinking, but with the modern free-floating currency, the full faith and credit of the United States, and a lot of guts. For the MeidasTouch Network, I'm Max from UNFTR. You can sign up for our free weekly newsletter at unftr.com, and make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel at UNFTR for more of this kind of content, but with a little more profanity. Thank you as always to the Meidas Mighty for having me, and I'll catch you online.
Want to stay plugged in? Become a subscriber to our Substack at MeidasPlus.com. You'll get daily recaps from Ron Filipkowski, ad-free episodes of our podcast, and more exclusive content only available at MeidasPlus.com.